Welcome to our weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche. She's the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. Today is April 2nd, 2025. I'm Harley Schlanger, and I'll be your host. You can email your questions or comments for Helga to questions@schillerinstitute.org or post them on the chat page. I would say to you that this is an extraordinary opportunity for you to engage in dialogue with one of the leading experts and activists in the world, so take advantage of it. As we're speaking today, the question of war and peace remains a central topic for virtually everyone. And despite some progress on improving relations between the US and Russia, the war hawks in Europe are preparing for war against Russia. Netanyahu is escalating a drive to remove the Palestinians from Palestine, and there's a memo circulating in the Department of Defense from Secretary of Defense Helga Zepp calling for preparing for war with China. So Helga, the first question for you comes from someone who follows Russia very closely. He writes that Putin last week said that the old order is gone, but do not expect a change from Europe. Putin went on to say that Russia has responded to sanctions by changing its economy to survive, but he expects more sanctions from Europe anyway. So the question for you is, why do European leaders not recognize this, that their plans are not working? Are they so blinded by Russophobia?
The short answer to that is yes. I think it is a phenomena that, the German elite or the elite, this German establishment, and many other in Europe as well, seem to have rebounced back to an outlook we had more than 80 years ago. I feel very, in a difficult position to say that, but there is no other explanation. Because how can it be that the vast majority of the world population has a completely different view on Russia? You have the global South who completely refuse to take the narrative about that the Ukraine war has been caused by an unprovoked, aggression by Russia, which violates international law. And on that point, I just want to tell our audience, that is you, that story cannot be maintained because, as if it would be necessary, naturally, the New York Times 2 or 3 days ago had a 13,000 long article, which was the result of a year-long investigation interviewing 300 different individuals from many different countries on the circumstances of the outbreak of the war against Ukraine. And what they clearly established is, they start with the immediate prehistory of the actual beginning of the special military operation, that there was very clearly, first of all, there were these massing of Ukrainian troops at the Donbass. And however, immediately after the war had started, the United States immediately deployed large amounts of troops, officers, personnel of various kinds into Ukraine, to the Russian border. Now, as many other experts have clearly demonstrated, the Russians had only planned a very limited military operation because they had only about 100,000 troops at the Ukrainian border, by far not enough to have an entire war against Ukraine. But obviously the presence of the Americans and maybe other NATO troops, we had French, Figaro was reporting about French troops at one point, but these troops were deployed from Wiesbaden, from the Clay house, the Clay Kaserne in Wiesbaden, basically commanding every step, even the direction of the cannons, to the greatest details. So the Americans and therefore NATO were in the war from almost the very beginning. Now, if you take then, in addition to that, the fact that Victoria Nuland was bragging that the State Department had spent $5 billion dollars on the NGOs and other purposes in Ukraine before the Maidan. Then the circumstances of the Maidan, the involvement of the West, the taped interview between Nuland and Ambassador Pyman, and then you had the Minsk II sabotage, which was admitted by Merkel and Hollande. So if you take this whole story together, the NATO was in the war from the very beginning, preparing it, instigating it, and that is now all officially out. So one would think that these European establishments would say, oh, wait a second, our narrative is no longer manageable. We can no longer keep it up. No, Baerbock, on the same day of the New York Times article, goes to Kiev, promises, in a I don't want to characterize it. I just leave it at my suppressed impulse to characterize it. But, so she promised continuous support, even beyond this present government. So there is no inkling of recognition that their lies have been caught, that there's now, the New York Times is after all the newspaper of record in the United States. So I think there is a really, I would say, almost clinical defect in the thinking of these people. And, I think it is very terrible because, what happens is Europe goes bonkers, Europe falls apart. Look at the totality of what's happening in Europe right now. I think, the effort, for example, in France to suppress Le Pen as the opponent of Macron, who is far ahead in the polls, can only backfire. Likewise, the situation in Germany is completely chaotic. So I think these elites are definitely not fulfilling the oath they have given when they took office to defend the common good of their people. And they are for sure in a parallel universe. And it can only end badly for them, but in the worst case, for everybody.
We have another question on the War and Peace from Paz in Spain. And she asks, Dear Helga, what can the Schiller Institute do to prevent the rearmament of Europe, the war against Iran, and everything that the neocons in the City of London with Trump and Brussels are planning against world peace? Is it enough to speak out at conferences? What are the people of Europe doing to prevent this madness?
Well, I think it is definitely moving, not fast enough. We will have conferences. We will have one in the United States. We will have sometimes also one in Europe. We participate in the demonstrations. We definitely want to encourage a lot of people to participate in the Easter marches around Easter, to go to the streets. I think this is absolutely necessary. And, I think we are experiencing right now a complete collapse of the trust of the people in all governments, or almost all governments in Europe. In Germany, the situation is unbelievable. You have, after 3 weeks of a little bit more of negotiation of the new government, or the attempted new government, with the aim to put Friedrich Merz as the new chancellor, the whole thing is falling apart. The reports are from several sources that the tensions between the SPD and the CDU-CSU are worse than at the end phase of the so-called streetlight coalition. And everybody says we are preparing for new elections because this will not function. The difference between this so-called coalition and the AfD is 1%. Now you go on for one more week and the AfD will be ahead. So we are seeing right now a complete chaos and transformation of all of Europe. And I think it is extremely important to intervene everywhere, in the demonstrations, in the conferences, in interventions, in all kinds of events, with the one message: the only way how we can lift this present situation out of this chaos is to establish a higher level, a new paradigm of a dialogue among all countries on the planet to establish a new security and development architecture, which must take into account the interest of every country. I think we are moving inch by inch closer to that idea, because the idea that you have to do something completely different, move away from geopolitics and address the pressing issue of humanity, that is a thought which is becoming more popular as the non-workability of the present policies becomes obvious. So join us in that effort, and maybe you can get us in touch with relevant people in Spain, because Spain is a very important country right now, because Spain has a policy which is not as mad as that of the so-called coalition of the willing.
Now, we have a report from the Washington Post that Secretary of Defense Hegseth is distributing in the Pentagon a memo that is ordering the Pentagon to put its focus on preparing for a war with China. Do you know, is this an update on what they had in the previous National Defense Authorization Acts, or is this something new?
No, I'm afraid it's just an update, but it's a continuation of the same policy to declare China the prime adversary of the United States, which is completely ludicrous, because, unfortunately, the Trump administration seems to be running into some real troubles. They are only in for 6-7 weeks. And already now, because of the broken promises, one can say, the base of Trump is revolting. We know that from many discussions our colleagues had inside the United States with MAGA people, with all kinds of groups supporting Trump. And they are very upset that Trump is not sticking to his promises that he would not only end all wars, but not start new ones. So, I think this is absolutely terrible, because, we are sitting on a time bomb with Iran. If now you add the conflict with Ukraine is not yet settled, and if you now add the crisis with China, this could blow up in a big time. The minimum it will do in the short term is to absolutely increase an arms race, both in terms of conventional weapons, nuclear weapons, space weapons, which I think can only lead to a catastrophe. So all the more important it is that the countries of the global south must be brought to the forefront, because they have no interest in such a new division of the world, where, the United States is clearly militarily still trying to maintain a dominance in the world. There were just hearings in the Senate where several space commanders were saying that the United States must gain dominance in space with all kinds of new weapon systems. I think that's really, very, very bad. And if there would be a war with China, I'm absolutely sure that the United States would lose badly, because, if you look at the geographic position, let's say, of Taiwan or the South China Sea, the United States would be in a vast disadvantage, just simply because of the geographical conditions. And, there is naturally always the possibility to go nuclear, which was a big concern of Daniel Ellsberg, because there were plans in the Pentagon already in '58, considering the use of nuclear weapons if it ever comes to a conflict with China over Taiwan. But that would trigger Armageddon, and I cannot imagine that President Trump would go that way.
You're listening to Helga Zepp-LaRouche, the founder and chairwoman of the Schiller Institute. We have time for more questions, so you can send them to us at questions@schillerinstitute.org, and Helga's happy to hear from you and take your questions. I have one from a friend of ours in Pakistan who said that he's raising this question of the use of normalization with Russia as an opportunity to focus on China. But he writes, Indian Foreign Minister Jaishankar is discussing rapprochement with China and seems very serious about it. What would be the implications of a normalization of relations between India and China? It seems that this would blow apart the whole idea of global NATO if India and China would work together.
Well, there are very promising signs, not only what you reported about Jaishankar, but also President Modi, Prime Minister Modi has made similar statements. There is soon the 75th anniversary of the relation between China and India. And I think they are planning to solidify that, because I think that India is definitely a non-aligned country, and they have withstood all efforts during the Biden administration to pull them into the camp of the so-called democracies versus the autocracies. So I think that is definitely a promising sign, and that is why I'm saying that, you know, we have to encourage all the countries of the global south, and that emphatically includes Brazil, it includes Indonesia, it includes naturally India, many African nations, to take a stronger role. And, you know, I think that they can really, if they all put their weight in, I think that the countries of the so-called West have to reconsider, because it's not just Russia and China, but it is the fact that the BRICS countries, which is now 22 members, and many, many more have applied for membership, but they are representing the entire global south. So therefore, the stronger the voice of the global south is heard, the more people in the United States and Europe have to consider that the future of the world is belonging to the global south, simply by the mere size of the population. So that, I think, is a very important element in the picture.
Now, I have a question here from a retired journalist who's an American who now lives in Israel. And he asks with very bold, large capital letters, are you paying attention to Qattargate, referring to the legal problems Netanyahu has tied up in bribery and a scandal involving money coming from Qatar? He writes, as the legal noose is tightening around Bibi's neck and demonstrations against him are growing in Israel, he is escalating in Gaza and Lebanon and making more threats against Iran. Is there a chance that Trump or any other leader will act to prevent a horrible tragedy from being unleashed by a desperate Netanyahu?
Well, I think that is the most worrisome question at this point, because you have not only a new threat by President Trump with some ominous remarks that very bad things will happen. You know, there is an ultimatum to Iran to completely get rid of its nuclear program, which includes apparently the missile system, to which Iran has already answered very clearly that they will not do that under no circumstances. And, you know, so therefore we are looking right now at a complete escalation against Iran, which clearly, you know, is in the interest of Netanyahu. And if you then take the fact that there are all kinds of weapon systems being brought in the region, apparently the THAAD missiles are being brought there. There are several aircraft carriers on the way, either to the Gulf or the Pacific Ocean or the Mediterranean, in any case, in the region. And, you know, there are apparently several B-2 stealth bombers being brought to Diego Garcia, the US-British base in the Indian Ocean, which, you know, I mean, all the signs are that there is a major preparation for a military sustained action against Iran. Now, if that will happen or not, obviously remains to be seen, but I can only say that, you know, if it is supposed to destroy the nuclear weapons or the nuclear program by Iran, there is a fatwa still by Khamenei that Iran does not try to acquire nuclear weapons because it is against the spirit of Islam. the crazy thing is even the US intelligence services in their recent report about Iran stated very clearly there is absolutely no evidence that Iran is preparing a nuclear weapon program at this point. Nevertheless, this drumbeat is occurring. And, if for some reason, the British instigation, there is Sir Dearlove basically demanding action against Iran, and he has been instigating this for a long time. If that has success, it would be a catastrophe, because the only way how you can eliminate the nuclear program of Iran is by the use of nuclear weapons, because these facilities are deep down in many mountains, and therefore you cannot just, even with bunker buster bombs, you cannot eliminate it. Now, if nuclear weapons would be used, Kucinich, the former congressman, has just put out a warning saying, if there would be any attack on the nuclear facilities, even I think without nuclear weapons, the danger of a fallout would not only kill tens of millions of people inside Iran, 100 millions in the neighboring countries, Pakistan, Afghanistan, as far as India, many other countries in the region, and it would lead to cancer, child, babies being born with deficiencies, all kinds of horrors. And he's warning in the strongest terms against it. But I think that danger is very acute, and I think it has to do exactly with what you are saying, that Netanyahu is desperate. The opposition against him is growing. The Qatar scandal, as you call it, could blow up. And, the big question is, what will the Israeli military do in this situation? So we are sitting on a complete powder keg. And also the Russian Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov just warned very strongly in Moscow that any such military motion against Iran would have catastrophic consequences. Wang Yi, the sort of foreign minister of China, is presently in Moscow discussing both with Lavrov and with Putin. And obviously, this is very high on the agenda, what to do to stop that. I think, the aim of it would be clearly to end the presidency of Trump. I mean, we have been talking about this with many experts in Europe, military experts in different countries, and there is a joint assessment that the aim is to decapitate the Trump administration, to cause such a havoc that it would be finished, that Trump would basically be out, because the domestic opposition against him would rise. You could have an explosion of the oil price, which would trigger a financial crash. And the aim is basically to stop Trump. That's the real aim of it.
Here's an interesting question from Harrison. He doesn't pose it as a question, but he says, I feel often overlooked metric in economy is the importance of population growth. The global South has a very important advantage in that way, and much of the rest of the world, including the West and East Asia, there's a low birth rate. How do you address something like this?
Well, I think it is a phenomenon that right now the African continent is the only one which has significant growth, population growth, which means that they have the brightest perspective for their economic future. Because in all countries, in Europe, in the United States, even in China, in Russia, you have demographic curves which mean that the percentage of the aging population is going to be larger and larger as compared to the population in the working age. And that naturally, it can be compensated. It can be compensated by extremely high economic growth rates. If you have a lot of injection of science and technology into the economy, you can manage that at least for a certain period. But I think it has to do with the, in China, for example, I had many discussions with scientific colleagues and scholars and friends, and they basically report that despite the enormous economic growth in China, the raising of children is still relatively too expensive for many couples to entertain such a perspective. I think that is a factor there. In Western Europe and in the United States, I think it has more to do with the meaninglessness of life. Because if you ask nowadays younger people, younger couples, what is the purpose of your life? You don't get a sufficient answer. They normally say they expect that the fortune of their children and grandchildren will be much worse than theirs or that of their parents. So they're looking at the development as a downhill spiral, and therefore they don't want to have children. So I think, what would be absolutely necessary is to redefine the issue of what is the meaning of life. Why are we here? Why is life existing? What are we doing on the planet? What is the role of the human species beyond our planet, in the nearby space, in the universe at large? And these questions naturally are not being discussed, or at least not in any meaningful way. And I think it has to do with the fact that people have become so shallow and so, downtrodden in their outlook, enjoying the moment of the life, having fun, but being not intellectually. I think the problem we have in the West in particular is that our so-called establishments have become so void of intellect, so void of, any kind of intellectual excitement or progress, and unfortunately that reflects the dumbing down of the population over a long period of time, so that the small percentage of people who are still intellectually vibrant, they feel like that they are in a minority, that their voice is not being heard. And I think we have a real crisis in the West, and the birth rate is a result of it.
Now, I have two questions for you on something you brought up earlier, the Le Pen verdict in France. There's a note from an aide to a member of the European Parliament who wrote to me and said that what she's accused of is done by almost every office in the European Parliament. That is the so-called mixing of funds, party funds with running the office funds. But the other question that came in is, what are the implications of this? Is this a possible civil war in France? Why would somebody choose this time of chaos to add to the chaos in France?
Well, on the first question, it is very significant that Antonio Di Pietro, who was the main, I think, judge in the clean hand scandal in Italy. If you remember, this is many years ago, when the corruption case in Italy, became the dominant issue. And, in Italy, everybody knew that in the entire post-war period, you had the principles of amici di amici, that, you would give contracts to your friends and you would help each other. And so that was the system. So this was obviously known to the intelligence services and not spoken about for decades. But then at a certain point, they decided to take down the entire party structure as it had evolved in the post-war period. And they launched the clean hand scandal. Now, the main accuser in this was Di Pietro. And he came out today criticizing what happened with Marine Le Pen, by saying that he worked himself as a parliamentarian in the European Parliament at one point, and he can say from his own experience that you absolutely cannot differentiate when do you deploy your staff for tasks which have to do with the EU in Brussels, and when do you deploy the same staff for a work from your party at home in your home country. That it's the nature of these things that, you know, they're mixed because it's the same people who are doing both ways. So it's a completely ludicrous accusation. And obviously it reflects Macron's desperation because he is down in the polls, you know, I think somewhere 20% or somewhere very low. And Marine Le Pen had polled around 40%. So it was very clear that she would be the winning candidate for the next election. So, you know, obviously a not so independent court system. And this is not the first time that the court in France is acting in this political way, because we had this done to our candidate Jacques Cheminade several times in the past, where, you know, they try to orchestrate and you know, manipulate the situation, which, you know, is typical for the so-called democracy. I mean, the more you experience these kinds of things, and I must say what happened to my late husband, and, you know, the organization, I mean, it is impossible to still believe in democracy when you see that anytime a candidate who is not with the so-called NATO narrative gets the Romanian treatment or the LaRouche treatment, you know, then you lose any trust in the system. And that's exactly what is happening. That's happening in France, and I can only guess that they will have very large demonstrations. The new party name, I forgot, the RN it's called, you know, they already called for large demonstrations in many French cities. And, you know, as the whole financial economic crisis gets worse, who knows where this will end up. And likewise in Germany, you know, if they cannot pull together a government, and how can they, you know, I mean, they are trying to put now a government together, you know, of parties who have been absolutely opposed to each other in the election campaign, and now they're supposed to find a compromise. Naturally, it doesn't function. It shows the weakness of the parliamentarian system. And, you know, they accuse China to be an autocracy, but the so-called all-inclusive democracy, which they practice in China, is a model of democracy which may even function much better than the so-called Western system. But I think we are heading towards a huge crisis in both countries, in France and in Germany. And, you know, there are now leaks that the new coalition, while they're having this infighting and difficulty to even form themselves as a government, there is already a leak that they are preparing a new paper to punish those EU members who are not fulfilling all the rules. Now, they don't name Hungary, but it's clear that they mean Hungary, and that they may want to expel Hungary from the European Union. If they do that, I think that's the death knell of the European Union, because this will have a signal effect, and many other countries will leave the EU as well. So while right now the threat posture coming from NATO and the European Union looks very big, I think they are very fragile and very brittle if you look at the foundation on which they stand.
You just anticipated the last question, which is related to Germany and the difficulty in forming a coalition government when the two leading parties are increasingly unpopular. But the person asks, is this a problem with the parliamentary governments as they exist in Europe, in particular in Germany and the United Kingdom, where you have minority coalitions, where you have governments that have very little response to the issues of the constituents and the population? Would there be a possibility of reform to move from a parliamentary system to a strong presidential system, or would people declare that that's too authoritarian?
Well, I think that the presidential system does not fully solve the problem either, as you can see in the United States, where you have more of a plutocracy than a democracy. I mean, given the fact that Wall Street spends several billion on a Senate seat, average, and there's many millions on a congressional seat, and then these congressmen and senators show an incredible loyalty to the military-industrial complex and other aspects of Wall Street. I don't think that is not a real answer. I think what is needed is something much more fundamental. I think we need a large movement of state citizens, because any system does not function if the citizens are corrupted. You need people, individual people who step forward, coming from their professions as scientists, as teachers, as all kinds of normal craftsmen, doctors, all kinds of different walks of life, and then decide to devote a certain time of their life to the common good, and they have to try to qualify themselves that they could be the president or the chancellor or the minister because they have mastered economics, culture, history, science. I think we are right now in a situation where the typical, professional politician, many of them in the Bundestag, for example, they never had a profession. They have not learned anything to earn their living. They have never paid taxes. They came from university, which in many cases they did not conclude. And then they go into politics and they are not competent. That's the problem. We have a foreign minister in Germany who does not know what the word diplomacy means, because she has not ever, in the 3 years she's in office, ever demonstrated that she knows the art of diplomacy. Nevertheless, I think we have as I said before, it's a much deeper intellectual crisis of the West, because where are the people who are independent thinkers, who have accomplished, vast areas of knowledge, on their own merit? It's becoming a minority, and it's not the people who are running the parties. So I think we need sort of a new, I think that there are some parties where you have more intellectuals than others, but I think we need really a cultural renaissance, because the entire, post-Christian culture, as the Foreign Minister Lavrov has named it once, that has led to a complete elimination of the entire body of knowledge of what used to be 2,500 years of European history, with everything which goes with it, which was part of the Humboldt education system. That has to be reinstalled. The problem now is that we don't have teachers who are competent in that. So I think we need really a above party movement of citizens, because the party structure as such, I think it's a model which has proven that it doesn't function.
Last question, Helga. The International Peace Coalition continues to meet with these Zoom calls every Friday at 11 o'clock Eastern Time. What do you have planned for this week?
Well, obviously, we will have a lot of very important speakers from Israel, from the region of the Middle East, because that's where the biggest war danger is occurring right now. And naturally, we will definitely have top speakers on the evolving strategic crisis, and even the, China as a new coming feature in it. So you should definitely get tuned in there, because the IPC is a forum where people from all over the world have the opportunity every week to get the unfiltered view from top experts, and you get up to date in the discussion, and you can participate. If you register, you can participate in the discussion, and that's what you should do, and you should get the news about this event to all of your friends and colleagues.
Well, thank you for joining us today. It's always good to see you, and I'll be seeing you on Friday.
Yes, and get very active with us until then.